Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come on in. I will give you a moment to connect to your audio. Welcome, welcome, welcome. All right, let's get started. Happy New Year, everybody. Welcome to this first Friday lecture for the month of January 2026. Our speaker today is Basic Programs Distinguished Instructor, Claudia Trout Distinguished Instructor, Amy Thomas Elder. Amy's lecture is entitled Reading Great Books Against Apocalypse. This First Friday lecture is supported by the Anastopoulos Lecture Series Fund in memory of basic program instructor George Anastopoulos. My name is Noah Shafetz. I am the Cyril Ohul Chair of the basic program. Please note that this presentation is being recorded so that we can make it available on the Graham School YouTube channel. During the lecture and during the question and answer period that follows it, you will not be able to unmute your microphones, but we invite you to enter questions for Amy in the chat box at any time during today's event. Amy will have a chance to respond to your questions after her lecture. During the lecture, Amy and I will be able to see only a handful of your video feeds, so you may want to leave your video off or turn it on. It's up to you. Amy's video will be spotlighted during the lecture, so the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view instead of gallery view, something you might want to do now. Before I give Amy a full introduction, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the basic program and the Graham School of Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies at the University of Chicago. So along with the basic program, the Graham School offers an array of programming, including our Masters of Liberal Arts program and our open enrollment courses, as well as a number of events and travel study opportunities. Since 1946, the basic program has offered students a rigorous education in the liberal arts through direct engagement with original text in discussion-based courses led by highly dedicated instructors. At the heart of the basic program is our four-year course sequence, which offers firsthand encounters with some of the greatest works of the classical and Western traditions in a community of adult learners. Our next First Friday lecture will take place on February 6th. Our speaker will be basic program instructor Richard Hoskins, and the title of Richard's talk will be Camus, Sisyphus, and the Defiance of Nihilism. Today's speaker, Claudia Trout Distinguished Instructor Amy Thomas Elder, holds a BS in biology and advanced degrees in classics and the study of religion. Her research at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago dealt with allegory and textual interpretation in early Christianity. She has taught in a number of different contexts, including a museum, a Girl Scout camp, middle school, high school, college, and seminary. For many years, Amy taught in and directed the Odyssey Project, a college-level humanities program for adults living on low incomes as part of the Bard College Clemente course. And Amy has been a basic program instructor since 1999. All right, let me end my presentation and turn things over to Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
Thank you, Noah. Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to learn from a student that the basic program did not make up the First Friday discipline, but picked it up from the Catholic Church, at least some of whose representatives told her that if she went to First Friday Mass, the Blessed Virgin Mary would come to her funeral and take her to heaven. She added that she thought this was useful preparation for reading about nuclear war over Christmas. I'm going to share my screen now. And make it big. Nod if that's good, Noah. Thank you. My remarks today are adapted from a paper that Elder and I presented at the recent ALSCW conference in Columbus, and I will not miss this opportunity to thank the Securing the Future initiative for supporting basic program teaching staff in such endeavors. One other preliminary, I so much appreciated the slides of Cy Twombly's art that Simon Friedland showed in his wonderful lecture on Simone Weil that I have been inspired to copy him. And I'm going to show occasional images from Anselm Kiefer with where you are able to go see it, if I happen to know that. He is a German artist born in 1945 who grew up playing in the rubble of a war that no one talked about, a world that had somehow ended without making sense of itself. And he devoted his life and art to trying to recover a German history and a German myth. This is one of several canvases that Kiefer has entitled Athenor. It depicts the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, the seat of the Nazi government. As you may know, an Athenor is a tool of alchemy, a self-feeding furnace or oven for the transformation of base metals into gold. This painting makes it look like you are falling into it. Around our house, we frequently quote a line from Euthyphros from Plato's dialogue of that name, which some of you must know. Socrates asks him what piety is, and Euthyphros says, "Piety is what I'm doing right now." It's so easy to undertake a careful and critical inquiry into some moral or ethical matter and determine at the end of it that piety is exactly what you're already doing. And in the next hour, I'm going to try to persuade you that what we should be doing in light of the growing sense of threat and doom and apocalypse is reading great books with one another. But I hope to do that in a way that does more than merely allow us to wallow together in our righteousness. As some of you may also know, last spring, elders in my ongoing exploration of issues and problems of modernity arrived at Apocalypse, and where do you go from there? This year, we're doing a series called The Ends of Humanity, with the S in those clever parentheses, meaning both the telos or destiny of humanity on the one side and its terminus on the other. And we're using apocalypse in its double sense of end and revelation, which I'll come back to. In the ends class, we read classic theoretical and literary texts along with short pieces from contemporary discussions of existential threats, some more optimistic, some more pessimistic, with the intention not of talking endlessly and fruitlessly about rising sea levels and current political events, but allowing us to bring our concerns about those things along with us as we read classic texts. As anyone who's been part of the basic program knows, part of the power of reading a classic text together is that it focuses discussion of important issues at a depth below or a height above the polarized and polarizing impasses we seem to arrive at. And ideally, it allows people on different sides of the chasm to talk to one another, and also reveals some historical contexts and philosophical contours of our fundamental ideas about freedom, responsibility, moral judgment, the limits of knowledge, and all the rest. At the same time, we each come with our individual needs to find coherence. And if those books are truly great books, then they must be able to speak to our present situation. And that's one which, by any metric you choose, like popular movies, for example, is concerned, if not obsessed, with existential crises and the possible end of the world. This quarter, we'll be looking at ideas about evil and our responsibility for it, all with the existence of nuclear weapons and plans for using them in mind. Asking again how the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons bears on this most fundamental of moral categories. The class has been an experiment, and at least one student referred to the group as guinea pigs. We're not ready to pass judgment yet, except to say that it's been transformative for Elder and me, and we thank the students who've given us the opportunity to do it. On the whole, and most of the time, we think that by having various competing contemporary assessments of our situation in mind, the classic texts were enhanced and made all the more urgent. I want to begin now by saying a bit about classic texts today at the beginning of 2026, and then something about what against apocalypse is supposed to mean, and then turn to a couple examples. The middle part is the dense one, so get ready. If I asked everybody here to type into the chat why we read classic texts, I expect we get as many different responses as respondents. Feel free, by the way, Noah's reading. So mine is just one way of putting it, but I hope it will resonate. We read the classic texts of our tradition in order to discover how we got here, wherever this is, where our foundational ideas came from, how they've evolved, what the controversies have been, and how our cultural imagination has been shaped. An Australian girlfriend of elders, a product of public schools with compulsory Latin, was astonished that Americans didn't know it, and therefore, of course, the etymologies of our words. How do you know what you're saying? She asked. You might say that reading classic texts allows us better to know what we're saying when we talk about rights and the pursuit of happiness and justice and love and all the rest. We read classic texts to see how our tradition has led to us, which is not to say that we're the pinnacle of civilization, just that this is where we stand. And it appears to be on a trajectory from somewhere to here, and by extension, from here to somewhere else. It may be variously described, but on the whole, it's one of the progress of science, of secularization, and the decline of traditional patriarchal forms of authority, of increasing inclusion, however hesitantly, of increasing sophistication in the ways that we understand social and cultural realities, and ultimately increasing concern for the rights and freedom of the individual. Critique also, of course, is central to the tradition and comes itself to be incorporated into even its canon. Without saying that it's all good, we can call this progress in the sense that we can conceive it as more or less directional, though of course with reversals and dead ends, or at least that has been my own conception. We read each text then within this trajectory, and the trajectory becomes part of the background of all our interpretation, both of the text and the world we live in. Our four-year curriculum, by concluding with American founding documents, tacitly encourages us to see ourselves and our form of government as the culmination of this long history. The implied imperative here is one of citizenship, to make free people wise, in Robert Hutchins' words that Fred Beitler has now made immortal. And by including Toni Morrison's Beloved in that quarter now, we have also attempted to internalize critique and to project the American project into a more just and equitable future. For those of you who haven't reached the modern tradition yet, this is Hegel's spirit coming to know itself in history. But now, in our omni-crisis, as it's been called, we've become aware of another possible future, or rather the cutting off of all possible, or at least all desirable futures, by the unintended consequences of our scientific and technological progress. And the end is not just a terminus, but also a revelation. Not a revelation at the end, as the Jewish and Christian apocalypses from the turn of the era, but a revelation by the end, as in a story, the ending changes and reveals the meaning of all that has gone before, which is one way of reading Solon's proverb, count no one happy, that is, blessed, until they're dead. Will humanity and its project have been blessed? Hans Jonas proposed that when we're thinking about a possible end of human civilization, as by nuclear war, we ought to give more than equal weight to the most terrifying scenarios, calling for a heuristics of fear with regard to nuclear weapons. We might more accurately call the approach recommended here a heuristics of doom. As we think about our humanity, our civilization, its greatest literary and philosophical works, its achievements, historical development, it makes a difference whether we see all of this as, on the whole, progressing towards justice, wisdom, and truth, or whether we see it moving towards self-destruction. Even the non-zero possibility that we might destroy the conditions required for humanity to survive on Earth, it seems, must change the way we see everything, including our great books. I will try to show that it makes them simultaneously suspect and more important than ever, and in a way that cannot be resolved. That is, it creates a paradox. And if you see me resolving it, let me know in the Q&A, because I shouldn't. There is, by the way, a movement against this heuristics of doom, which holds that thinking about stuff you can't do anything about is counterproductive and unhealthy, unethical, and maybe even blasphemous to the American way. There's an organization calling itself CFACT that we learned about from a student that goes around starting its chapters on various campuses, the way Campus Crusade for Christ does, preaching that climate change is really not so bad and it's the worrying about it that's damaging. From my own experience, I would agree that thinking about these things doesn't make you feel better, and it probably doesn't make you a better person either. As I'll try to explain, I don't even think it conduces to wisdom, certainly not to, quote, practical decision making that leads to human flourishing, as the University of Chicago's Arete Institute puts it. But it might keep you from a confusion or paralysis that sets in when you have to deny the realities that you also have to live with. What I want to consider is what the humanities in general and what reading the great books together in particular have to offer. How is it that there is a union of concerned scientists setting a doomsday clock, but no union of concerned humanists to consider, along with the possible extinction of Homo sapiens, the end of humanity and the difference between the two? Speaking of the union of concerned scientists, some of you may know Daniel Holtz, astrophysicist and cosmologist studying gravitational waves and black holes, and the chair of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which sets the doomsday clock. Holtz says, when it comes to existential risk, many of the challenges are no longer technical. We understand what the risks are, as well as possible technical solutions. The problems are now of a different character, including social, political, psychological, and theological domains. We need humanists to help make progress. Holtz is not alone. A number of authors we encountered last quarter, including Roy Scranton and Amitav Ghosh, have said that we need humanistic responses to our existential crises. But what do we need them for? We've sampled a flood of recent books and articles explaining existential risks and the urgent needs to confront them. And while they have a lot to say about the risks to human beings and other organisms and the conditions of their life, they have little to say about our humanity as something distinct from our species and its conditions. And by humanity, we mean more than the sum of living or even potentially living human beings. And by conditions, more than adequate rainfall and temperatures human beings can live at. By humanity, we mean the object of humanistic study. This seems like a place to begin to think about what humanists have to contribute, a vision of our humanity as we encounter it in our texts, from its shadowy origins through its myriad expressions, its art, ideals, sacrifices, knowledge, purposes, and hopes, and its non-material, its ideal or spiritual, all the words seem wrong, conditions. It seems categorically different to see humanity threatened, to see what is implied in the extinction, not just of one more species, granted one to which we're particularly attached, but of humanity. Could there be Homo sapiens apart from humanity? Since our humanity is not given in nature but shaped through culture, it seems possible and terrifying. It might be a task for a union of concerned humanists to articulate the meaning and the obligations of our humanity in ways that might allow us to see what's at stake and to find the moral resources to confront existential risks together. But then there's another question. Should the prospect of a cataclysmic end to humanity alter the way we view the so-called Western tradition, and more specifically, how we regard canonical texts and our practices of reading them? With apologies for all the ways it oversimplifies things, let us say that it is Western science, or that of the, quote, global North, that built atomic weapons and then used them. Western geopolitical order that gave rise to the insane arms race of the 20th century, Western capitalism that has led to the destruction of virtually all natural ecosystems, Western imperialism that concentrated wealth into so few hands, and Western democracies that have failed to respond to what can appear as a rush to catastrophe. How do we understand this? The liberal critique, feminist, post-colonial, Marxian, and so forth, has attuned us to concerns about our text's unacknowledged racism, sexism, and classism. What we're calling, with some hesitation, an apocalyptic critique is something else. It asks, can we find the sources of catastrophe in the canonical texts of our tradition? What if our apocalyptic situation is the natural consequence of the progress of objectivizing science, democratic institutions, and individual rights? What then? Our thesis is that, given where we are now, we need to read the great books of our tradition against apocalypse, by which we mean, first, that we must look to the canonical texts of our humanistic traditions in order to make sense of, and in some degree comprehend our situation, existential and historical, and to grasp the meaning and significance of the threats which now attend it. But second, and in tension with this, first, that to the extent these threats may be viewed as arising from and internally related to sources within our tradition, which is to say, to the extent that we regard our tradition as a unitary whole with its own internal logic, we must put the tradition as a whole radically into question. In other words, we want to argue that the idea of the great books now presents us with a difficult, if not a terrible, paradox. That being definitive for a culture which has come to seem terminally bent on self-annihilation, they cannot fail to be regarded with a certain degree of suspicion as possibly sinister, perverse, or pathological, and at the same time, being definitive for what we mean by humanity, at least for our culture and possibly beyond, they remain for us unique sources of both illumination and normativity, and therefore indispensable to any attempt even to comprehend and respond to our situation. All we can offer is a tentative exploration of this paradox, with the aim of trying to clarify, not resolve it. To this end, two things we believe are essential. First, to insist on the idea that the practice of reading classic, great texts, however fraught and internally contested, must be conceived as part of a more comprehensive discipline of knowledge, roughly corresponding to what we have come to regard as the humanities, literature, art, music, philosophy, history, but reconceptualized in light of our historical situation. And second, to propose that the knowledge we derive from this practice has become newly urgent, not just for making sense of the mess we're in, as Beckett put it, nor for promoting any particular virtues of wisdom, nor finally for whatever bearing it may have on the prospects for the survival of the human species, though a case might be made for any and all of these, but simply in order to affirm what must be affirmed, which is to say, our humanity, its significance, its persistence, and its dignity against apocalypse. This is to affirm also an imperative to a consciousness, to an active resistance against all that would deny, distort, or negate our humanity. So that even the most radical forms of canonical skepticism may finally be encompassed within a higher affirmation, or so we hope and believe. I've said a bit about the value of reading great books, but I want to say something further about the issue of their authority, because that might be controversial. By a great book, what I mean is one that's open to and demands multiple reading, and that both refers to and generates discussion of fundamental human realities, however you conceive them. By a classic text, I mean one that is both great and recognized to be great, either generally or by those qualified to make such a judgment, granting all the objections. Such a text assumes personal significance, bears a certain weight, and has important implications, at least for many readers. And it is generative, raising questions that matter, urgent, compelling, potentially transformative questions. Above all, it is capable of challenging our accepted common sense ways of understanding ourselves in the world, reorienting us to a more comprehensive or more profound or more problematic understanding of things, one that bears its own imperatives and interdictions beyond those of the social determination. Texts only become classic within a tradition and through a history of appropriation, criticism, and continual reassessment. Like all true works of art, they are in this sense made in their reception, or as the philosophers would say, constituted. And they are in constant process of being remade or just undone within different historical, social, and cultural contexts in response to constantly changing needs and interests. Classic or canonical works, or better, our efforts to understand those works, thus convey both historical and, if you will, ontological knowledge. Properly read and appreciated, they not only teach us the meaning of human realities, urgencies, as Brooks and Warren say in their wonderful book, Understanding Poetry, but show us, at least implicitly, what those realities are. Through reading and discussing such works, through the effort to make sense of them, we are constantly referred to and compelled to make continual reference to the deeper grammar of our humanity as such, its enduring conditions and imperatives, its constraints and interdictions. This is what it means to be a man or a woman or a human being or a hero or an artist or a friend. And this is what you have to do to achieve those things. This is what it means to suffer, to endure, to know yourself, to succeed, to love, to be happy. The judgment, the imperative, the constraints are not usually explicitly stated, but the whole sense of the narrative, the poem, or the project depends upon what is implicit as a matter of sense. We judge the work, but the work also judges us. If such works have authority, it is not in what they convey directly, but in the way they constitute the very possibilities of understanding our humanity, what it demands and what it entails. Through them, we internalize a kind of depth grammar of our humanity, which we then appeal to in order to make sense of and comprehend any great work of art, literature, or philosophy. Though it's something that never comes fully into view and something that can be neither definitively stated nor adequately conceptualized, but which guides and directs our reading and inquiry through a kind of pre-understanding, and if properly followed out, toward increasing sense and coherence. In the end, that is, it's not what Moby Dick says, much less what Melville thinks that matters, but how reading his novel reorients us to this deeper grammar, which stands behind the figures that populate our imaginations and provides the dramatic forms that configure and impart sense to our experience, that shows us what it means to fall in love or to have a destiny or to resist evil, and in the long run, educates us even about what is truly worthy of our love and directs us toward the proper ends of a human life. As conditions of sense and meaning, these works give us the forms that make such experience possible and also prescribe the ends and ideals in whose light alone they become humanly meaningful and significant. They are prior to us, prior to anything we can ask about them, whether or not we recognize them, but they configure the deeper sense and deeper imperatives of our lives. A classic text, then, is one that, through our reading and our discussion of it, reveals, however obscurely and indirectly, the deeper grammar of our humanity. And through our practice of reading classic texts, we internalize this grammar and it becomes real for us, not just of ideas, but of sense. What our education by way of classic text provides is some larger historical and conceptual context for what we have swallowed down in our socialization, as well as an alternative, a more demanding human world beyond the lowest common denominator of trying to get along and trying to be happy, which can allow us to regard the social reality with some measure of objectivity and criticism. The knowledge we acquire in this way is more performative than discursive, no matter how much we like to talk about what we think we've learned. To internalize the grammar of humanity is to act from a different point of reference than that of common sense or practical wisdom. It's to be in some degree freed from the force of socialization and convention, to feel oneself apart from the social determination, not for the sake of that freedom, as some have argued, but to feel the weight of imperatives that are not customarily available to us. The grammar of humanity asserts itself in the imperative mode, or it's just one more consoling fiction. You must change your life, says Keats's Urn. A classic text has at least the potential to convey this deeper imperative grammar, whether or not we make it conscious. But an apocalyptic critique, proceeding as it does from a projected end of humanity, not as the culmination of human striving, but as its catastrophic demise, differs from what a pervasive liberal critique, which reads the logic of the canon from the perspective of progressive triumph of liberal values, individual rights, freedom, inclusion, and diversity. Instead, it recognizes the unsustainability of current social, economic, and cultural arrangements, and by implication of modern liberalism itself, both political and cultural, It is concerned not with promoting individual freedoms and the ends of individual fulfillment, but with promoting a form of moral consciousness appropriate to our situation, a new ethic of responsibility, according to which, as Hans Jonas argues, we collectively assume the obligation to preserve and protect the conditions of humanity as such, and embrace this obligation as our highest human calling. Apocalyptic critique sees the logic of history as one of progressive preparation for a final catastrophe. And though basing itself on an ideal of individual conscience and responsibility, it recognizes with trepidation and alarm the deep ambiguities and contradictions at the core of Western individualism. Amitav Ghosh puts it as frighteningly as I've seen. Climate change may require us to abandon some of our most treasured ideas about political virtue. For example, be the change you wish to see. What we need instead is to find a way out of the individualizing imaginary in which we are trapped. In a world in which only globally collective action could begin to address existential threats, the focus on individual political virtue would be a distraction at best. Some argue that the whole emphasis on individual consumer choice as a way to combat global warming is ideological and even calculated to maintain the status quo. It was British Petroleum, who came up with the idea of a carbon footprint. We can talk more about this in the Q&A if people want. If we are, in fact, or just possibly in a fatal situation, then the status of all of our nominally classic or canonical texts has to be put into question, not as previously because they're seen to conceal some unrecognized ideology, hidden contradiction, or unconscious motive, but because they seem now to belong to some previously conceived logic of destruction, even evil, because it now seems that the end of humanity may not be freedom or consciousness or the liberal state, but self-destruction. And this logic has been at work since the beginning of human history, or at least the history of the West. And if we are as deeply formed by our classic texts as I have argued, it means that it's in us too. So we find ourselves at this impasse. Are we now to locate the sources of the impending catastrophe within our humanistic traditions, and more specifically within its canonical texts? Does it make sense to say that our apocalyptic situation is the natural and inevitable consequence of the progress of objectivizing science, democratic liberalism, emancipation from traditional authority, and exaltation of individual rights? Which is to say, as has been argued, that it is somehow the inevitable product of our Christian and Enlightenment heritage? What if the arc of the moral universe bends not to justice after all? It seems as though it would have us try to put into question the ground that we stand on, not unlike Wittgenstein's treatment of doubt in uncertainty. It seems like we move here from paradox to logical impossibility. Hannah Arendt found herself at a similar impasse, I believe. Though she didn't use the term, the origins of totalitarianism could be taken as an example of apocalyptic critique, in that she attempts to understand the reality in which we live after Auschwitz as at once unprecedented and uniquely revealing. We can no longer afford to take that which has been good in the past and simply call it our heritage, to discard the bad and simply think of it as a dead load, which by itself time will bury in oblivion. The subterranean stream of Western history has finally come to the surface and usurped the dignity of our tradition. This is the reality in which we live. And this is why all efforts to escape from the grimness of the present into a nostalgia for a still intact past, or into the anticipated oblivion of a better future, are vain. She writes in the preface. And the rest of the book may be seen as an effort to identify that stream and to suggest how the tradition's dignity might be in some measure be restored. For her, totalitarianism, as the expression of absolute evil, brings about the destruction of humanity, of new beginnings, spontaneity, politics, memory, that is, of everything that is for her the essence of humanity. And so it is in itself an existential threat on the moral level. She draws on the tradition whose dignity has been usurped to describe a watershed, the emergence of mankind as one political entity, which faces the need to find a whole new way of thinking a standard of goodness. She says, the greatness of this task is crushing and without precedent. Only an extreme calamity, supreme calamity, could have forced us to face it. This is a most profound and challenging claim. How many of us feel the task of thinking a standard of goodness to be crushing? And why should it be? I'm not going to answer that either, but you can try and we can take it up in the Q&A. The existential threats facing us now are continuous with the catastrophes of the 20th century, if not still more portentous. And we seem to have lost the subterranean stream, or as I'll call it, red thread, that came into view with Auschwitz and Hiroshima. We need a new conception of our historical trajectory, one which begins from where we find ourselves now and discovers a past consistent with it, one that looks for and attempts to trace the red thread through and within our tradition of classic canonical texts, even as it must always do so in light of illumination which only those texts can provide. But whatever skepticism, suspicion, or even cynicism we may bring to bear upon our cultural tradition, it would be naive and dangerous to suppose we can jettison its canon and embrace a different tradition and its authority, or be free of them altogether. What is freedom without a standard of judgment, of goodness, as Arendt says, just indiscriminate, unless we yield entirely to the social determination and exigencies of the moment? On the other hand, to return to traditional forms of authority is not only obviously problematic, but it seems safe to say just impossible, short of a massive cultural regression. Almost safe to say. This means, among other things, resisting fantasies of a restoration of an integral community. As you know, there's a lot of discussion of a return to the earth, and not just in fiction, and some of those visions are quite seductive. In one low-budget eco-apocalyptic video, we encountered a woman who claims to be in recovery from Western civilization. I wish her well, but I don't believe her. More cogently, Amitav Ghosh calls for a new fiction and even a new politics, including non-human agents with whom humans have different kinds of relationships. This is challenging and perhaps promising, but again, not our question here. Look for details about events with Mr. Ghosh in Chicago in May, by the way. We can and must look to other traditions and new art forms, but the question here is about how to deal with our own classic texts. This is our dilemma, and once more the paradox, which now attends the practice of reading classic texts, with an eye to the assumptions, developments, and arguments that have contributed to our present situation, trying to understand something of the logic at work in our history, though again, without intending to arrive at any kind of definitive explanation for how we got where we are. Such explanations may be possible for the historian or the social theorist, but not for us. We're seeking illumination, not answers, and we're not looking for some point at which civilization took a, quote, wrong turn with agriculture or Christianity or the Enlightenment or television or whatever. Whatever the impetus that eventually brought us science, democracy, and rights may well have been present from the beginning of humanity, perhaps in language itself. But that's not our question. And part of what we need to understand is how it is that we seem so unable to confront and respond to the facts of our situation. How we got into this mess is a different question from why we can't deal with it. How is it that there can be such widespread awareness of the precarity of our situation and insufficient will to confront it? At what cost to the sense of our lives do we live in denial of it? A committee of basic program instructors, by the way, is at work on a class on denialism as part of the Classic Text Contemporary World initiative to be offered in the autumn. It seems as if the same tradition that has brought us to our existential precipice has woefully unfitted us to deal with it. Please don't think that I mean to exclude myself from this situation. I can read about the virtually inevitable death of the 2,000-year-old baobab trees and of all the coral reefs and the melting of all the Arctic ice by 2050 and be quite literally nauseated. And half an hour later, I'm planning the next trip to Costco. We, all of us, though some more than others, continue to deny the reality of the threats which confront us now grown drastically more real in the past decade or so, despite everything that our best science now tells us about them, and perhaps even against our good intentions. This is, we believe, a failure of education, not to the facts, but to the reality of those facts, which is to say, not a failure to understand the science, but a failure to comprehend its human significance, a failure which could perhaps only be rectified by education in the humanities and, yes, through the discipline of reading classic humanistic texts together, recognizing the need to address some general inadequacy in our own education and character formation, and to develop the sensibilities and intelligences that were once and might be again an object of humanistic education. Of course, I realize how offensive all of this sounds, but if the task of a humanistic education is to educate us to the realities of our human and historical situation, and if those realities make demands upon us, how could such education not be more urgently necessary now than at any other time in human history? We need to find our way to a new responsibility, if only because not being able to be responsible is unbearable. Not to save humanity, but to understand what it would mean to save it, what will have been lost if we lose it, what it ought to have become. Our responsibility is no longer just as citizens and individuals, but as representatives of and witnesses to humanity and its impending catastrophes. An apocalyptic critique thus reads the cultural tradition as a whole, and classic texts in particular, from the perspective of this new responsibility, and on the assumption that, with events of the past century, human nature itself has been definitively called into question and perhaps decisively changed. This means that we need to approach each text with a kind of double vision, looking to it on the one hand for the normative sources of our humanity, and at the same time suspicious of how it may belong to and further an underlying logic of destruction. In one sense, of course, this is hardly new, since all critical reading looks for how even the greatest texts are implicated in effects which have come to appear detrimental or even pathological. It's just that now the stakes are incalculable. It's not, again, about deciding what's good and what's bad within any text, nor arriving at some right interpretation, but about what we assimilate, an enhanced awareness of and appreciation for the cognitive and moral background to which we appeal in trying to make sense of and comprehend the text. This is why we read together and why it needs to be an ongoing practice, because as soon as we return to our daily tasks and habits, at least for most of us, the sheer weight of our immense economic, political, and social reality asserts itself in its own imperative mode and necessarily draws us back into it. But this is also why the paradox of reading, though a source of constant unease, is not finally crippling or fatal to the enterprise. In the end, it's not what Plato says about, for instance, justice, or how Sophocles or Ralph Ellison dramatizes it, but the reality of justice itself as a standard of judgment that matters. We must find within our own tradition the means to criticize it, and more importantly, to examine ourselves, since within it will we find the ideals, values, images, and myths by which a human life makes sense and has significance. In sum, reading against apocalypse means interpreting simultaneously in two directions. First, towards a recovery or discovery of the deeper grammar of our humanity, comparable to what Ricoeur calls a hermeneutics of retrieval, and at the same time towards a concerted judgment against that logic, conceived specifically now, wait a minute, as cultural rather than social or economic, which seems now to impel us toward catastrophe, a variant of what Ricoeur calls a hermeneutics of suspicion. In contrast to Ricoeur, though, an apocalyptic reading aims less at retrieval of a lost meaning than a distinctive mode of illumination, the revelation of a grammatical imperative, and less at uncovering some hidden duplicitous meaning or reality, economic, psychological, or philosophical, than a disclosure of the red thread that links our cultural past to the current crisis by whatever mechanism or means. The suspicion is not that the text is inconsistent with its own stated ideals, but that its ideals might be lethal. Let's look at a couple examples to see if that'll help. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as shall seem to them most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Read constructively in a mode of retrieval, this is perhaps cheating, in that we have a very clear and unambiguous statement of a foundational ideal, the foundational ideal of liberal democracy, and a powerful statement of what might be called philosophical anthropology, an implicit definition of what the human being is and should be, namely an autonomous judge of his own ends. And frankly, whatever may happen, I really can't imagine giving this up, even if it means the destruction of the earth. In a class, I'd like to discuss how to understand happiness here, if it is something the individual pursuit of which a government exists to protect, and failing to do so ought to be abolished, which means presumably that wars might be fought for its sake. What kind of happiness is worth a war when any war might escalate into a nuclear exchange? I'm not answering that. You can in the chat. This might imply something very serious and even moral, perhaps in the Aristotelian sense of the highest and most complete goal of the human being, and perhaps implying Aristotle's own definition of happiness as the highest good, following from the fulfillment of the proper function of the human being, an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. Granted, the Declaration makes no such moralizing claim, and we might take happiness to be no more than whatever the individual wants to pursue as long as it doesn't interfere with others. But still the question remains, what is that third thing besides life and liberty that deserves the dignity here accorded it? To what would we appeal in making such a judgment? And then where's the red thread? Where do we see the coming crisis, the inability to see and respond to the threat of total destruction? There are surely many ways of answering this, but one might be to say that we have here a clear statement that of the precept that political authority exists to serve the needs and rights of the individual, consistent with a progressive erosion of traditional forms of authority and insistence upon the rights and happiness of the individual. The conditions of what Isaiah Berlin has called negative liberty, that is, not being interfered with. But lacking a unifying authority and lacking confidence in any authority, lacking a shared concern with common purposes, individuals are rendered less and less capable of meaningful collective action, what Berlin calls positive liberty. In a world in which each person's happiness or flourishing or health, wisdom, love, self-development, family, self-expression, and so forth, is held as the highest end, and in which each one is their own highest authority, it is necessarily difficult to reach consensus about common obligations, imperatives, and responsibilities. But does the Declaration of Independence really lay the foundations for the coming narcissistic society in which each individual pursues his own individual ends to the exclusion of wider public good, immediate and futural, and aims at nothing higher than his own personal confirmation and gratification as the world drifts toward irreversible catastrophe? Not answering that one either. I'm going to skip a passage from Plato's Apology. We can come back to that in the question and answer if anybody wants. But I'm going to skip to what won't surprise anyone, Moby Dick. The 3 boats of the Pequod are fast to a very ancient sperm whale, blind, afflicted with an ulcerous growth, poor digestion, and a missing fin. And while waiting for it to surface, Ishmael reflects as follows. Seems it credible that by 3 such thin threads the great Leviathan was suspended like the big weight to an 8-day clock? Suspended? And to what? To 3 bits of board. Is this the creature of whom it was once so triumphantly said, canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears? The sword of him that layeth at him cannot hold, the spear, the dart, nor the habergeon. He esteemeth iron as straw, the arrow cannot make him flee, darts are counted as stubble, he laugheth at the shaking of a spear. This the creature? This he? Oh, that unfulfillments should follow the prophets. For with the strength of 1,000 thighs in his tail, Leviathan had run his head under the mountains of the sea to hide him from the Pequod's fish spears. Now we can hardly begin to consider the densely overlapping allusions, symbols, and references here, but the most obvious is to the conclusion of the book of Job, in which God answers Job's complaint by pointing at Leviathan, boasting that humankind will never conquer it, and telling Job to shut up and wonder. As I read this passage, Ishmael is both excited and dismayed that human beings have conquered Leviathan. And it's easy to link this passage to Melville's own struggles either to believe or disbelieve in God, and to the general disenchantment of the world occurring with the Industrial Revolution, for which whaling was so important a part in the first half of the 19th century. Moby Dick might be read as a reflection on the uncomfortable discovery of human independence from tradition and authority, the triumph of democratic values and of human industry, and the tragedy of the heroic individual who cannot accommodate himself. I mean, among other countless ways to read it. Moby Dick seems almost to demand to be read apocalyptically, and it takes little special effort to do so, as Ishmael's terror of the whiteness demonstrates, for it's a terror of the loss of the cosmos of the traditional meaning in nihilism, the revelation of nothingness and of annihilation. Is it that by its indefiniteness, it shadows forth the heartless voids and immensities of the universe, and thus stabs us from behind with the thought of annihilation when beholding the white depths of the Milky Way? Or is it that, as in essence, whiteness is not so much a color as the visible absence of color, and at the same time the concrete of all colors? Is it for these reasons that there is such a dumb blankness full of meaning in a wide landscape of snows, a colorless all color of atheism from which we shrink? This narrative of Ahab's quest ends with Ishmael's bare survival as an orphan whose only function, like Job's servant, is to escape the general doom and report on it. It is only too easy to see throughout the novel the effect of human industry on the natural world, which destroys what it doesn't understand and thereby destroys itself. And more, we see in Moby Dick, the great and grand hero who sets himself against nature, against humanity, against society. Ahab is the figure of the hero who can be traced back to Milton's Satan, the rebel who insists on creating his own reality and not accepting the limits imposed by God, but undertaking his own pursuit of happiness. This is what we have meant by hero, and it doesn't take much imagination to trace that heroism to the splitting of the atom. I would argue, though I can't hear, that Melville himself is aware of the dark side, but he can't help loving and revering it. So, to wrap up and get on to your responses. As things are now, it seems to demand a special effort of imagination to grasp even the peril to our species or to the ecosphere, let alone to our humanity. There are plenty of projections of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic scenarios, but many fewer sustained attempts to grasp the meaning of our humanity in this light, its history and its future, its conditions and imperatives, its responsibility, and its ends. Even to keep those threats in view is difficult in a world where 1,000 immediate things demand our practical and moral judgment and courage. And this is why we say that education in the humanities is necessary to be able to come to a more adequate view. There's no doubt that at some time in the not too distant future, existential threats will be the salient realities of everyone's day-to-day life, and it will be impossible to evade them. Even then, though, the meaning of those threats won't be obvious, and we should do what we can now to insist upon the preservation not just of our species and others, but of our humanity. If we destroy ourselves, what will we have failed to do? The concerned scientists keep appealing to common sense when common sense is, in the current situation, not only inadequate but perverse. Common sense tells us that tomorrow will be more or less like today. Common sense tells us we have a right to happiness and prosperity. It wants security and well-being. Common sense tells us that confronting existential threats is not only fruitless, but detrimental to our feeling of security and well-being. What we need now is uncommon sense. And where are we to find that, if not in art, literature, music, if not in the tradition of the humanities and its exemplary realizations? The sense of our humanity has never been common sense. It has always demanded developed sensibilities and capacities to see things in their depth, ambiguity, historical context, and implications. People don't need to be educated to morality. We need to be educated to the deeper normative sources of our morality. The apocalypse is no different, except for being more urgent. If we learn to read the great works of our tradition apocalyptically, we become increasingly able to inhabit an apocalyptic world. And after that, well, each of us must answer for ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So not surprisingly, we have too many questions for you to take. Then we have time for me to put them to you. But I've tried to organize these into some kind of rough order. My apologies in advance, both to questions that to people who put questions to which I will not get, and to people whose names I mispronounce. So Debbie Rusin asks,
Can I just say to those people, we should all appreciate how good Noah is at doing this. So thank you.
well, that has wrong-footed me. I wasn't prepared for that. Thank you, Amy. I'll do my best to carry on, red-cheeked and all. Okay, so Debbie Risen asks a clarifying question, which seems an appropriate first question. She says, so what I am hearing is that it may be our only hope as a civilization, not only to, excuse me, that it may be that our hope as a civilization is not only the recognition of the time on the doomsday clock, but rather the recognition of a more humanistic understanding of what it means to be human, which can be found through an understanding of the great texts? Question mark. So I take it the question is this what you're
Yeah,
saying?
that's better than I put it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. The next question comes from Anson, and I will go out on a limb and say I suspect this is Anson Tang, although I can't see him. Anson asks, what is the role of humanities in the conversation when some place their faith in future scientific discovery as a quote solution, end quote, to apocalypse, for instance, going to Mars or AI?
That's a great question. One way of thinking about that, it seems to me, is that if we consider that the kind of thinking that we ordinarily do, which is all about solving problems and getting things done and fixing things, if that is the kind of thought that has led us to the point where we are, then more of that thought is not going to pull us back. I would say that the the kind of the kind of hope of surviving on Mars, first of all, who wants to, but is further denying the value of what the humanities have to offer and making humanity itself just sort of the instrument of its own technology. And um, that'd be one way of responding. I'm sure there would be others.
Thanks, Amy. That is an interesting response. Okay, the next question is from Ray Lucchese. Ray asks, so he says, my question is, how can the humanities and the study of classical texts change the trajectory of humanity to self-destruction? There's a self-selected minority which reads and studies these texts, but how does such a minority have impact on the whole of the social political system that has placed us on this path and continues to push us to the apocalypse?
Thank you, Ray. I don't think it can. I mean, it's not about this isn't a project to save us. It's a project to understand who we are and where we are, and to try to think more more humanly about that situation. One of the things I found last quarter is in this book um, by Jonathan Weir, Imagining the End. The first essay is entitled "We Will Not Be Missed," and it's um, about what it will mean, what it would mean for the world, for humanity to disappear from the world, and recognizing that it wouldn't just be the extinction of yet another species, but it would be the loss of the good and the beautiful as we have come to love it. And we can affirm the good and the beautiful, and we can mourn its possible loss, and that in itself is good and beautiful. And that may be all we can do. Um, Maybe if everybody were properly educated in the humanities, there would be the kind of mass movement that would be necessary in order to start again the discussions around nuclear disarmament, for instance. But no, that's just going to take too long.
Thank you, Amy. The next question is from Valeria Volin. She asks, how do we talk about the apocalyptic questions the great books address, raise, or answer, if we are, Valeria adds, rightly so, to stay so strictly within the text? Can we have a venue where we attempt to take the next step, connecting books via, in parentheses, synoptical reading? Can we let the great books talk to each other and allow ourselves to interpret what they say about the great questions of humanity?
Thanks, Valeria. I mean, an extremely important question for us in the basic program. It seems Elder and I have talked about this a lot, and with Lynn, it seems to us that it would be it would be wrong to think that we just check our concerns at the door when we come into the basic program classroom to read the Mino. I mean, we're thinking about our lives and our problems and our fears when we come to read the Mino. And I don't think really it's possible to have the one without the other. The trick is being able to read the Mino in a way that can change the way that we see our situation, um, rather than trying to keep it pure somehow, and to keep our situation apart from it. Um, as I said in the class that Elder and I are doing now, we're consciously having people read little bits of things about existential threats, not to discuss in class, but just so that we like know everybody's thinking about them. And it does. I think it's worked pretty well to help us talk about the texts. And this is obviously something that, doesn't have to be done in every class, but could be done, I think, more widely than it is.
Thanks, Amy. The next question comes from Nanette Boulebosh. The question is, I would enthusiastically, well, it starts with a statement. I would enthusiastically join a union of concerned humanists. My concern, though, is that there are not enough of us. Far too few people, in the US at least, are convinced of the usefulness of the humanities in addressing our problems. Here's the question. How can we convince more people of the crucial role that humanities, and more specifically great books, can play?
Well, the basic program's on the way to doing that, growing at unprecedented rates. And I personally think that it has something to do with the fact that the world is so difficult to think. That people are looking for ways to help them sort things out. I don't know how to um, I don't know how to affect the whole of society, but Nanette, email me and we'll start it. We'll start the Union of Concerned Humanists, and we'll get a great web designer, and we'll see. We'll see what we can do.
Well, this is going on YouTube, Amy, so that's a little bit, we're doing what we can. Okay. The next question is from Ross Bagby. The question, so it starts with a statement again. A frequent element in Apocalypse is the faithful remnant, or as in the novel and miniseries The Leftovers, its dystopian variant, the guilty remnant, which is the chosen, the elect, the survivors who will inherit and rebuild. Even Last Man tales, like Mary Shelley's, have a witness bring observation, if not meaning, to the coming post-human world. What is your end of humanity, as distinct from Homo sapiens, bring to this element?
Yeah, thank you. Um, Amitav Ghosh actually has a really fascinating treatment of the apocalyptic narrative, the typical apocalyptic narrative of especially American movies, which are always about some catastrophe and about like the people who can survive it. And they're I would agree with him, are a kind of consoling fantasy. It's like, oh, it might be really bad, but like the smart scientist will survive because he sees it coming and he can like get his family out of whatever trouble they're in and like rig something in order to be able to survive. And that this is a consoling fantasy. This is not what we're really facing. Um, so I would say, um, I don't know if that if I just I would say I can't say much about that story of the remnant other than to say, um, the remnant is probably not going to be the best prepared people.
Thank you, Amy. The next question is from Raymond Steinbach. The question, so Raymond thanks you for the Anselm Kiefer paintings throughout the presentation and asks if you can explain their poignancy.
So Kiefer, I don't know if you saw the size. He makes these enormous canvases. The one I left up the longest is Lot's Wife, which is my favorite. The thing weighs a ton, 1 ton. Um, and he paints a lot of like in the late 80s was when he did these huge paintings with all kinds of unusual material, a lot of lead, and then he would take blow torches to them. um, some of them have little references to the poems of Paul Celan about the Holocaust. There's a lot of like train tracks going off into the distance, which recalls the trains to the camps. A lot of just sort of bombed out looking landscapes and snow. Um, they're just really powerful. And they have a sense of being put together out of rubble, out of ruins, in a way that bears some kind of witness, without making everything okay.
Thank you, Amy. Our next question.
There's
Oh,
a there's a great exhibit right now at the St. Louis Art Museum till January 25th, with more of his work than I've ever seen anywhere altogether. It's a little under 5 hours from Chicago. I recommend.
maybe they'll drum up some more members for the Union of Concerned Humanists. Okay. Tom Chiz asks, what are responsibilities to the unborn?
I think they're infinite, Tom. I think one of the things that a humanistic view does, I think, is connect us to a past and to the realization that we have inherited a past which was not just a bunch of random events, but involved a lot of people's lives and sacrifices and um, um, aspirations, and they gave it to us, and we need to give it to the next people. And I think the humanistic point of view makes it not just about. I read a lot of stuff. Um, one of them was like, how do we value future lives? How do we value the lives of people who aren't born yet? How do we weigh their lives against our lives or their needs against our needs? Which I would say is an absolutely unhumanist way of thinking about it. It's not measuring the utility of future lives. It's recognizing a tradition that is to be received and passed on.
Thank you, Amy. Greg Gosek asks, what about great books that specifically address apocalyptic situations, like Jose Saramago's Blindness, um, Cormac McCarthy's The Road, or John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids? Would their imaginative focus facilitate enhanced insights on the key dimensions of such extremes?
What was the last one?
John Wyndham's The Day of the Triffids?
I don't know. The Road certainly made a pretty deep groove in my own imagination. Um, I think I think there is value to imagining apocalyptic scenarios, post-apocalyptic scenarios, but I think the kind of it's not just because it would be so awful. Blindness also made an effect, had an effect. It's not just because it'll be so awful and people will suffer so much, although that's true. It's that we'll have failed to do what we should have done or known what we should have known. And maybe these visions make possible what that might look like. Um, and I think they're valuable. Yeah.
Thank you, Amy. Here's a question about something that's already come up earlier in the question and answer period. So Steve Luffname asks, could one interpret this quest to go to Mars as a derivative of the desire or the theme to find a promised land? I agree that I wouldn't want to go to Mars, certainly not my promised land. Within the American experience, we have this story or myth that we must conquer a frontier. Is this desire to conquer Mars the next expression of that myth?
Yeah, I think absolutely. Yes. And if when we're looking for a red thread in the Western tradition, this conquering nature thing and or peoples or would be one that we would want to pay attention to.
I think we have time probably for just one more question. This is from Tina Laurie. Question is humanity lost with unlimited access to so much knowledge without comprehension or fully absorbing the information? Seeing and hearing so much information, is that humanity? Are we the dissemination of humanity with unlimited silos of information or knowledge, meaning only learning from sources that agree with us?
The 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 distinction I would want to, thank you. That's also a very important question. The distinction that I would want to point to, which I tried to mention, is the distinction between facts and the meaning of facts. And increasingly, we have access to more facts than we're ever going to be able to assimilate. We have the difficulty of, post-truth, even knowing which facts are facts. But ultimately, what I think the humanist has to offer is reflection on the meaning of the facts. And we need the facts. We absolutely need the facts. And the facts are hard, and they're hard to think about, and they're hard to keep in view. But the meaning of the facts is what the Union of Concerned Humanists is trying to find.
I look forward to your newsletter. All right, that is it for our lecture and our question and answer. We are going to continue with a basic program tradition just now, which is that at the end of our online First Friday lectures, we will do our best impression of people who are all together in one place in an auditorium. I will ask you all to unmute, and we can thank Amy for this fantastic lecture with our applause and our voices. So here we go. Please unmute and thank Amy.
Thank you,
Thank
Amy.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Very
Well
amazing.
done.
Awesome.
See you
Awesome.
Tuesday.